A cruise missile cost north of $1 million. For 8 consecutive nights, the fleet had been spending them on targets that could hit back. The radar arrays and launch systems capable of detecting an incoming strike and answering it. Then on the 9th night, one was directed at a road bridge, a reinforced concrete slab over a dry gorge, the cheapest and most defenseless thing the entire campaign had touched, and somehow the most consequential. On paper, that is an absurd trade. You have expended one of the most advanced weapons ever fielded to punch a hole through a piece of civil engineering a freshman student could sketch out, and yet that single strike did more to the guard's position on the coast than a full week of hunting launch systems had managed. It was, without fanfare, the best exchange the campaign produced. The gap between those two facts, a laughable trade on paper, a decisive one in practice, is the entire story of what unfolded over southern Iran that night. It does not live inside the missile. It lives in the geography of a coastline most people could not point to on a map. A press release hands you the target list. It will not explain why a bridge outranked a launcher. So we are going to pull the coast apart ourselves, one crossing at a time, until the reason is sitting right in front of us. Start with the ground itself, because that is where the answer is buried. By mid-July, Operation Epic Fury, the campaign the United States had been running against Iran since late February, had entered its most sustained stretch yet. Night after night of unbroken strikes, 8 in a row and still going. Through that run, the bombing did what air campaigns typically do. It hunted the enemy's weapons. Launchers, radar positions, missile bunkers, one after another. It was working, but slowly, because weapons move. A mobile launcher destroyed tonight gets replaced from a storage bunker by tomorrow. By one intelligence estimate, Iran had recovered roughly 70% of its missile inventory, even under nightly bombardment, and still maintained functional access to most of its firing positions along the strait. Hit the forest, and the forest grows back. Then on the 9th night of that unbroken run, the targeting shifted. To understand why, you have to stop looking at the weapons and start looking at what they rest on. The Revolutionary Guard's entire approach on that coast is built around movement. Missiles on trucks that fire and scatter. Fast boats that dart out and disappear. Launchers that never stay in one place long enough to be caught. But every piece of that motion runs on the one thing that cannot move, the ground itself. A launcher can reposition in minutes. The road it repositions on has been in the same location for 1,000 years and will be there tomorrow. The Guard could conceal its weapons. It could not conceal the map. Now look at what that map actually shows. Because southern Iran is not flat country. The Zagros Mountains, the same range running the full length of the country, come down to their southern edge right here and drop nearly straight into the sea. What they leave behind is a thin ribbon of flat land squeezed between the mountains and the water. To travel from the interior down to that coastline, a road can only cross the mountains where the mountains allow it, where a river has already carved a gorge, or where the slope eases just enough to lay a roadbed. There are only a small number of those places. At each one sits a bridge or a tunnel. Those are the targets that changed everything on the 9th night. Not the launchers. The valves. Consider what a valve is versus what a wall is. A wall blocks everything along its entire length. It is expensive to build, and you can walk around its end. A valve is a single small point on a pipe, and closing it stops everything downstream, regardless of how wide the pipe runs. Southern Iran's road network works like the second type, a pipe with a few valves, and the terrain decided where they sit. Trace the map and they name themselves. The highway bridge on the Bandar Abbas to Rudan corridor, the bridges at Gahrieva and Kahurestan, threaded through the broken terrain near Bandar Kamir, the span on the route toward Surjan, the Shahid Mirza road tunnel bored straight through a mountain because no path around it existed. None of these is a hardened position. Each is simply the one place the ground permits a crossing, and because the ground permits so few, each one carries far more than its proportional share. One figure reframes the entire coastline. Take that intelligence estimate at face value, 70% of the arsenal restored, most firing sites still active, a force nearly back to full capability. But every missile in that stockpile, every shell, every launcher, has to physically travel from the interior down to the coast to matter at all. It can only get there through that handful of crossings. A stockpile that cannot reach the water is not an arsenal, it is inventory. This is the oldest rule in logistics. An army does not fight with what it possesses, it fights with what it can move forward to the line. A missile sitting in a bunker 200 miles inland is not combat power until it arrives at a launcher on the shore. Along this coast, everything moving forward has to funnel through those few crossings, sever them, and the deepest magazine in the country still leaves the guns at the waterline empty, which is precisely what that night set out to accomplish. But it raises the obvious objection, and it is a fair one. A bridge does not hide and does not run. If you destroy it, the enemy knows exactly where to rebuild, and armies have been throwing temporary crossings over broken rivers for as long as there have been armies. Dropping the span is straightforward. Making the drop permanent is a problem in physics. Begin by splitting a bridge into its two honest components. There is the span, the deck, the roadway, the part vehicles cross, and there are the piers, the columns and foundations driven into the riverbed that hold the span in the air. Those two parts fail on completely different timelines. Knock out a span and engineers can put a replacement deck across in days, maybe a couple of weeks for a difficult site. Destroy a pier, a mass of reinforced concrete sunk into the ground, and you are not repairing anything. You are constructing a new bridge from the riverbed upward, and that is measured in years. The entire value of a strike hangs on which part you hit, and the two parts can be a few dozen feet apart. That is why, for most of the history of air power, large bridges were nearly impossible to permanently destroy, not because the warheads were too weak, but because they landed too far from the one point that mattered. A large structure does not fall to the magnitude of a blast, it falls to precision, and there is one spot precision is searching for. A bridge deck carries its heaviest internal load, its greatest bending stress, at the center of the span, where its own weight pulls down hardest, and the supports are farthest away. That midpoint is where the structure is already straining against itself. Place a warhead there and you are not fighting the bridge, you are asking it to collapse under its own weight, and it obliges. That is the exchange the Tomahawk was engineered to make. A dumb bomb strips the deck off a bridge and engineers restore it by the weekend. To reach the pier, the component measured in years rather than days, you trade away the wide blast radius and in return purchase the precision to place one warhead on one concrete column from hundreds of miles out at sea. The missile carries a 1,000-pound class blast fragmentation warhead, sufficient to fracture structure without flattening a district, and it lands within roughly 30 feet of the intended point, close enough to choose the pier over the parapet. How it achieves that accuracy from that distance is where the geography comes back. The Tomahawk flies most of its path low, hugging the terrain, too close to the earth for many radars to separate it from ground clutter. To know its position without relying on satellites that can be jammed, it reads the shape of the land beneath it. A system that compares the terrain it flies over against a stored elevation map, correcting its course each time the two align. But that only works over ground with real relief, ridges, valleys, genuine elevation change. Over flat plains or open water, the system is nearly useless. It needs rugged terrain to navigate. The Zagros, the very range that compressed the coast into a valve in the first place, is precisely the kind of sharply featured terrain that guidance reads most effectively. The same mountains that trap Iran's logistics into a few crossings are the mountains the missile uses to find its way to those crossings. One range, two opposing functions. The prison wall around the enemy's supply lines, and the map the weapon reads to locate the door. So the span comes down at the right point to stay down. But armies carry pontoons. Engineers can float a temporary crossing over a gap in hours. If a crossing can be replaced by nightfall, what actually keeps the valve closed? The same thing that made it a valve. A pontoon bridge needs somewhere to anchor. Gentle banks, room to assemble on both sides, a river you can span with floats. But these crossings exist precisely where the terrain refused every gentler option: deep gorges, steep-walled cuts, a single road threaded through rock with no shoulder to work from. There is often nowhere to position a temporary bridge, and no room to assemble one, under the constant threat of a follow-up strike holding the site inside a danger zone. The very feature that made the crossing worth striking, a choke point the terrain permitted in only one location, is what prevents rapid repair. The terrain did not just select the target. It made sure the wound would not close. Cut the crossings and you have cut movement. But movement is not the only thing a coast depends on. There is a second type of valve on that map, and it does not sit on any road. It runs through a wire. The road network is one valve, the power grid is the other, and it obeys the same geometry. A different resource flowing through the same handful of failure points. To understand why it belongs in the same story as the bridge, consider how electricity is actually used on that coast. This is a stretch of desert with almost no natural fresh water, so the supply is manufactured, seawater forced through membranes to strip out the salt. And that process is not gentle filtration. Salt water naturally draws fresh water toward itself, so to push clean water the other direction through the membrane, you have to overpower that pull, crushing the seawater under 800 to 1,000 pounds per square inch, dozens of times the pressure of the surrounding atmosphere, without interruption. Every ounce of that pressure comes from electric pumps. The plant runs as a series circuit: power, then pump, then pressure, then output, each stage wholly dependent on the one before it. And a series circuit has a vulnerability a bridge does not. There is no partial failure. Remove any single link, and the whole line does not slow. It stops the instant pressure drops, and the membrane becomes an inert sheet of plastic. That is what makes the electrical layer read the same way to a targeter as the road network does. One transformer, one substation, one switching yard sits upstream of everything downstream of it, and neutralizing that single node takes the entire branch offline at once, the same way dropping one span closes an entire route. The strikes on the southern grid worked along exactly those lines. A transformer station on Kish Island, the power supply feeding the airfield at Iran Shar, a pumping and transformer node on the coast near Jask. Each was a single point whose loss cascaded down the whole line behind it. The targeting followed the same valve logic as the bridge, only drawn in copper and steel rather than concrete. The road carries movement and the grid carries power, yet both reduced to the same short list of points, where geography forced everything to funnel together, which is the whole reason the two belong on the same target map. Step back from the road and the wire together and ask what that night was actually an attack against. For 8 nights, the campaign pursued Iran's weapons. On the 9th, it went after the ground those weapons had to travel across. That single change of aim is the whole lesson, because it is the difference between attacking a force and attacking a map. Think of the coast as a network. There are nodes, the launchers, the batteries, the individual weapons, and there are edges, the connections between them, the roads and lines that allow anything at a node to reach anywhere else. Through that entire stretch of strikes, the fleet went after nodes. Nodes move, hide, and get rebuilt. That 70% figure is the evidence. You can bomb nodes every night and watch them regenerate, because a node is a physical object, and physical objects can be replaced. The 9th night went after edges instead. An edge is not something you own. It is a line the geography drew, fixed in position, impossible to relocate, and impossible to conceal, because you cannot hide where a mountain permits a road through. That is the reversal worth holding on to. Back at the start, that restored arsenal looked like strength. 70%, most sites active, a force nearly whole. But all that firepower was only ever hostage to a network the Guard did not own and could not move. It merely ran on it. Sever the edges, and the fullest stockpile in the world sits in the mountains with no route down to the fight. There is one more thing the 9th night demonstrated, and it lives in that word edge. An edge is pure geometry, a road, a transmission line, and geometry has no nationality. A grid does not recognize whose flag flies over it. The same series circuit that makes a substation on one coast a single point of failure makes a substation on any coast one. Once a campaign establishes that the decisive target is the network rather than the weapon, that proof travels. It is a repeatable method, not a one-off result, and every force watching can apply it against the same class of target anywhere the geography recurs, which along this sea of narrow desert coasts and imported power is almost everywhere. The hardest target to defend has turned out to be not the fortress or the launcher, the things built to absorb punishment. It is the thread, the single crossing, the single line, the single node that geography forced an entire region to depend on. Reading that map, identifying which node holds up the rest, is now the sharpest instrument in the theater. And anyone can pick it up because nobody built the map. The land did. Return to the trade from the very beginning. $1 million missile spent on a slab of concrete with nothing to shoot back. The worst exchange on paper the campaign ever made, and the one that accomplished the most. Now you can see why. That bridge was never a target the way a launcher is a target. It was the single point where an entire coastline had been forced, by the shape of the land itself, to hang on one thread. And someone read that thread off a map before a single weapon left the rail. The real weapon in this story was never the tomahawk. The strike was the straightforward part. The difficult part was reading the map, recognizing that the power on that coast lived in the connections, the roads and the lines, and that geography had already fixed where those connections had to run. And the harder part still is knowing where reading it should stop, because the map does not take sides. The same geometry that can lock one coastline can lock any coastline. The same thin valve, one span over a gorge, one substation feeding a grid, sits on the shore at Kuwait, at Bahrain, along every stretch of desert coast on this sea. Once both sides understand that a bridge does not need a gun to be worth destroying, that the target worth reaching for is the node the whole network depends on, the question is no longer who reads the map more sharply. Both sides can read it now. The question is whether there is any valve remaining on that map that one side still chooses not to close.